Ladies and gentlemen, what if Germany won World War II? Part 3. If you have not seen parts 2 and part 1, go check them out. There will be a card thing in the top right here, and I'll also put those links in the description below. So far, Germany has conquered all of Europe. France, Italy, and Britain, they're puppet states, and the big question now is, what is the United States doing? So in this video, I think that's mostly what he's going to focus on, but I also hope that he answers the questions that I have, which is what's happening to Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. And hopefully we'll see a bit of influence there and a bit of his opinion on what would happen if Germany won World War II. Without further ado, let's get right into it.
Hitler's Third Reich has conquered Europe and now rules over its people and governments with an influential hand. The meaning of European is quickly being changed. Individuality has been sacrificed for unity amongst every member of nations. The new Aryan generation, and by extension other Europeans, are taught new curriculums. Europe against all, and against a new enemy. Not the Soviets, who have been pushed into the Siberian tundra, a force across the ocean, untouched by Nazi soldiers.
So the Russians have actually not been defeated in this timeline, just for those who haven't checked out part 1 and part 2. They're actually just stalemated, basically, in the Urals.
The United States. If you haven't seen part 2 or 1, click here or in the description below.
Or check out my videos on them.
In part 3, I'm going to focus on how a Nazi victory has affected the United States. Europe may have fallen, but the United States, with its impressive economic force, still remained across the Atlantic. How does this affect our alternate timeline? Here is one scenario. America comes in, sucker punches Hitler in the face, then nukes Europe while jumping into the ocean. The end. Like
Perfect.
on Facebook and... No, I'm just kidding.
All right, guys, thank you for the reaction. No, just kidding.
An event like the Nazis conquering Europe certainly changes global politics, but it wouldn't automatically put the globe under Nazi domination. Nations left uninvaded now have to interact with the Third Reich in their own way. Some could become collaborators,
Hungary?
others staunch enemies, others future targets. In this video, I'm going to focus entirely on just two nations, the United States and Nazi Germany.
Sad. So it looks like I'm not going to get my answer on what would happen to those. What do you think would happen to Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria? Let me know what you think in the comments. Oh, that was Jay.
In this alternate timeline, Germany is able to secure Europe from outside American invasion. Even though the US could raise up a decent-sized army and military effort, the incursion into Fortress Europe would simply be suicidal, especially as the fascists begin reinforcing their holdings. While the other parts mention decades, this part will focus on the years immediately after Hitler defeated the British and continued to push back the Russians. In our timeline, the Pacific War and European War were disconnected from one another. Japan and Germany were both united in a goal for more living space for their people, but their alliance was one of convenience, not of ideological similarities. By the time Hitler had invaded Poland, Japan was already waging brutal war against the Chinese in French Indochina.
Right, and there's something to note too that a lot of people would obviously, and the most reasonable thing to consider is that World War II started in 1939, though arguably it really did start in 1937 with the invasion of China from the Japanese forces. And by the time Germany invaded Poland, China had been fighting Japan for nearly 2 years. Right, this was kicked off by the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which led to Japanese forces invading China. So at this point, I wonder so I'm assuming that Japan completely defeats China, but then do they hold on to the Philippines? Is America going to focus more on them? Let's find out.
War was noticed by the Americans, who placed an embargo to convince the Japanese to stop aggression. This oil embargo crippled Japan, cutting off around 90% of their oil supply and immediately placing them in a crisis.
And this was one of the reasons why that they invaded the southern resource area, is because they needed those supplies to be able to fund the war effort. The oil embargo from the USA, and this is in our timeline, by the way, the oil embargo from the USA was completely crippling to Japan's economy and their resources. And their idea was to very quickly attack and then gobble up those areas in the south as fast as possible. So that's why Pearl Harbor was executed in the manner that it was. It was supposed to be a quick strike that was going to damage the USA. They'd be able to pick up those islands in the south and then hopefully negotiate in some sort of manner. Because they knew that a sustained war with the United States was not winnable in any manner. They knew that right out of the gates. So I'm curious though if maybe something like Midway doesn't happen, right? Or maybe Japan defeats the United States Navy. I'm curious.
They could either stop their war effort, but instead they chose to go on the offensive, seize the natural resources of Southeast Asia, and negotiate with the Americans to maintain the land they conquered. Japan knew they could never win a total war against the economic
It's almost like I just said that. Oops.
might of the Americans, but if they were to cripple the US's fleet and stall their offensive capabilities, negotiation to Japan seemed like an option. In this alternate timeline, no matter if Hitler conquered Europe or not, Japan would have bombed Pearl Harbor to secure their own imperial ambitions. The United States is now at war with Japan in this alternate scenario as well. Yet even though the US does not want to wage a war against the fortified Germans, the Germans could still wish to fight a war against the Americans. In our timeline, Germany declared war on the US. Hitler did so under his own vision, and not because of any treaty obligation with Japan. Hitler had many misconceptions about the power of Japan and the weakness of the United States. In our timeline, Hitler's advisors warned that a war against the US only would harm the Reich. However, Hitler dismissed their opinions.
However, it's important to note that the Kriegsmarine were very, very, very in favor of declaring war on the United States so that they could get the same sort of unrestricted submarine warfare that which they had in World War I, which would be able to sink U.S. shipping vessels and everything like this. So it's not that all his advisors were against it. There were definitely some that was pro declaring war on the United States. I think it was the line, I don't remember who said it, was that great nations they declare war, they are not declared upon. Something along these lines.
This alternate timeline can be split between two different scenarios, each created from one decision, whether Nazi Germany would declare war on the United States. So first scenario, Hitler decides to go to war. If Nazi Germany successfully defeated their enemies in Europe, a declaration of war by the Reich would be much more of a threat in this alternate timeline. When Hitler declared war in our own timeline, it was seen as an opportunity for the Americans to get involved in the war. Even though the situation in 1941 was grim, it was not lost. Germany was fighting on two fronts, and declaring war on America brought a new player into the European theater. German leaders knew that Germany had no capabilities to strike the US directly. In this alternate timeline, the Germans would need to invest in long-range bombers to attack the US, creating the America Bomber Project. In our timeline, Hitler always wished to bomb the East Coast with nuclear or conventional weapons, yet he focused resources on weapons of science fiction, and not on easily achievable inventions such as long-range bombers.
And I went into the why Germany couldn't win World War II video. There's a section on the Wunderwaffen, which is wonder weapons that the Nazi leadership was heavily focused on and overlooked some more conventional things such as long-range bombers. They overlooked radar, for example, and a few other technologies in favor of these ridiculous sort of super weapon projects, so to say.
Scenario, even if the America Bomber is developed, the aircraft couldn't fly from North America and back, so it would need to be sacrificed over enemy territory.
What about if you went to Iceland, though?
A simple bombing run wouldn't be worth destroying a plane over, so the payload needed to be greater. If a war between the Americans and Germans began in this alternate timeline, it's unlikely either could or want to launch a land invasion into the enemy continent. It would be too costly. The war between both is on two phases: conventional air and naval warfare, and the race for nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb wouldn't be the weapon to end the war as in our timeline against Japan, it would be a weapon to make bombing runs worthwhile across the Atlantic. In this alternate timeline, whoever developed a nuclear weapon and successfully could drop it on the enemy has the political and military advantage over the other, so the race is on. Neither would gain a reasonable advantage in the naval campaign, and so war is simply to defend coastal cities from the other.
So let's assume that the Royal Navy then is in control of the Germans. I think that's fair. However, if the Royal Navy was able to escape in any manner or was able to sort of reconvene in Canada, which is where the royal family is right now, in this timeline, of course, I don't quite see how the German Navy could have had a stalemate, right? Or would have been evenly matched to the American Navy at this point. The American Navy, as well as the British Navy, was really quite exceptional. So not quite sure if I agree with him on that one. Again, this is all just theory and opinion, but it's an interesting idea of having a stalemate sort of in the Atlantic.
Even though Japan attacked the United States, Germany was much more of an immediate threat. Most American technological resources would go to getting an advantage over Germany, coastal defenses, and preparations for German bombing runs. However, Japan still attacked the US, so the US would still fight a Pacific War against the Japanese. Japan never would have been able to defeat the Americans. The US controlled their oil supply, and both sides knew Japan was outclassed economically by the United States. Japan couldn't rebuild lost ships. US could. For Japan, it was always going to be a losing battle. This alternate Pacific War could be very similar to our own, considering nothing occurs in the mainland US up until the very end. In our timeline, the only reason the atomic bomb was allowed to drop was because the political climate allowed it. Japan's allies were defeated, Japan was isolated, and the US was tired of war. There were no major political repercussions for such a final act. In this alternate timeline, even if the United States had a nuclear bomb, they wouldn't use it on Japan. They would only use it on Germany if they had the opportunity, as was the original plan before the defeat of Hitler in our timeline.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. I wonder, though, because it's the same issue of where and how would they have dropped it here. I mean, what's interesting, though, is that he hasn't quite talked about this yet, but Iceland is an interesting geographic point here because it sort of lies in the middle between North America and Europe. And I would imagine that this key resource would be incredibly sought after by the Axis powers or America. Well, I guess we'll call them the Allies. The Allies in North America and the Americas, and then the Axis sort of in Europe.
The US pushed Japan back in this alternate scenario. The policy is to contain and firebomb the Japanese homeland. Firebombings of Japanese cities killed more than the nuclear bombs.
Yes, and that's one thing that's important to consider. Firebombing is just absolutely ruthless way of waging war. If you read some of the horrific stories of towns that were totaled by firebombing and the people that suffered under them, it's horrendous. And the loss of life was outstanding. There's obviously the famous firebombing of Dresden, right, as well. And that's just something that's important to consider that I think a lot of people forget about, is that yes, the bomb did kill a lot of people. Was it necessary? Obviously up for debate. I think people are quite clear on their sides on that one. And but firebombing was just a brutal method. Was it justified? I'm not here to say, but yeah, just something to consider. And I think that a lot of people can sometimes forget.
To the Americans, the Japanese aren't important enough targets for nuclear weapons. The Americans simply destroy Japanese will and economic capability to wage war, the conventional way. So in this alternate scenario, the US obliterates Japan's cities nationwide, devastating the entire country. After months of Dresden-style bombings of Japan, the country literally cannot fight anymore. If Japan surrendered, we'd see a similar occupation as in our timeline. If not, the US invades and the air bombings obliterate every Japanese town and village. The populace cannot fight off an invasion, no matter their willpower. This alternate path is only possible if the United States develops a nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany. So would Germany have gotten the bomb before the United States?
No.
No. In our timeline,
thank you. I thought he was about to say yes.
Factors led to the U.S. having an advantage over the Germans in nuclear development.
Tons.
The U.S. had both British and German scientists who were scared of the Nazis. Also, Germany could not invest as much energy into nuclear research as Americans, as most German effort went into the Russian conflict. Yet even with some changes by the alternate timeline, it's unlikely the Germans could have held on to their new territory and developed a nuclear bomb while at naval war with the United States. The US, who would deal with much less internal pressures, has a greater advantage over the Nazis. Just because the US would create a bomb first, does not mean Germany could not create a bomb at all. Even with...
So you read about the Manhattan Project and just the sheer amount of material and resources and time and effort and money. My God, the amount of money that went into developing the bomb. And the uranium too, like just the resources that America had. I mean, I think at one point that's like 75% of all the hydro, which is a Canadian term for electricity, was being used in Nevada, was going towards the bomb, right? It was something along these lines. It was just a ridiculous amount of energy that was being used that Germany just simply could not afford, even in this alternative timeline, which they're talking about immediately after Britain has surrendered to the Nazis. Just not possible.
With a nuclear attack in this alternate timeline, it wouldn't cripple a nation. It'd be a political blow, maybe even a tool to create unrest, but realistically brings the world into an age where nuclear warfare is the new normal. An atomic strike by either side in this alternate timeline is a dangerous prospect, as while devastating, it still allows the other nation to retaliate back. So I'm concluding in this alternate timeline, if the United States and Germany did go to conflict, it's very likely it would collapse into nuclear war, even limited nuclear war, with cities on the coast such as New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. being destroyed. As the devastation would commence, protests and riots would occur as people fear for their lives across both Europe and North America. As rocket technology advances, the nuclear war could expand across the continents, in a scenario very similar feared in the Cold War, utterly destroying both nations as nukes bring social unrest to even the Third Reich itself. Now earlier...
See, but the thing is, though, is that it just comes down to the technology, and I just... Okay, so maybe if they sit there, and give them 3-4 years to develop the technology between it, but I don't know. I think, maybe I'm just overthinking it, but I really think that this territory here is really, really important. And I'm kind of sucks that he didn't mention, maybe capturing specific ports here so that you get a much closer route to either of these locations. So.
Destroying both nations.
But who knows? Maybe I'm just focusing too much on that one.
To even the Third Reich itself. Now, earlier I mentioned there would be two different scenarios which could occur from one decision. The first was Hitler decides to go to war. The second is Hitler decides not to. In the second scenario, Hitler listens to his generals and realizes that it isn't in his best interest to help Japan and attack the US. So in this alternate scenario, the US can focus all of its energy on Japan and the Pacific War, still pretty similar as in our timeline. However, the Americans are in constant worry that Hitler may change his mind and launch a naval war against the US in the Atlantic. In our timeline, after the atrocities of the Holocaust and the millions of deaths in Hitler's war, Nazism was discredited forever. Americans can't imagine fascism ever being considered. However, before the war, in the turbulent Great Depression, the boasting, flag-toting fascists certainly had an appeal to some in North America.
Yes, that's very true. There's the famous the German Bund, which was a pro-Nazi club that was initially funded by the German government. I think it was Rudolf Hess that was sort of in charge in a way of funding these groups, and they were relatively popular. I think they had a few thousand members, and they actually staged a event at Madison Square Garden. And there's a very short film about it. I think it's about 8-10 minutes long. That's one night about this, and you can see the protesters outside, and they have these giant banners of Washington, which is really interesting. And they have the sort of Americana flags, and there's speeches given, and actually one man, he ran up and he tried to basically assault the person who was speaking, and he's sort of dragged and beaten off stage, and it's some really, really powerful imagery. Of thinking about what it might have looked like had this organization been able to continue to grow. I believe it was shut down near the late 30s, and so obviously interest completely died down in these sort of organizations by that time. But if you ever have a chance, go check that out. I'll probably just link it in the description. Heck, I might even do a reaction video to that. Who knows? We'll see.
Even among prominent American capitalists. In our timeline before the war, company leaders admired Adolf Hitler for his boasting personality.
Depends on whom. I mean, Henry Ford, definitely, but not
Hitler
all.
won over many prominent American businessmen with cheap labor policies. Both parties shared similar views on communists and labor forces. Both parties were incredibly anti-Semitic, as many were at the time. Germany in the 1930s became a suitable market for American companies to invest in, no matter what their government said. Even during the war itself, American companies remained in contact with their German counterparts. In this alternate timeline, without a war, this relationship blooms to its full potential. With the Nazis having won the war and resistance practically useless, companies are the first to accept the new order as a valuable market. In our timeline, Hitler held complex views of the United States. He saw that the country had a sizable population of ethnic Germans, and attributed most of the country's accomplishments to them. Yet he also despised the influence of the Jewish and black populations in the country. He admired the US racial segregation and eugenic policies it employed on minorities. Hitler believed that the Aryan majority of the United States was being controlled by a government under a Jewish conspiracy. He personally hated President Roosevelt. Since the Nazis had relatable views already held in many places in the US, segregation, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, without a war, the Nazis would become less despised by parts of the country as years went on. The Nazis were still German, which was better to the US than the Japanese.
Interesting. So just a few points there. In terms of business sort of continuing on and just sort of accepting world politics as it was and continuing to do business in Europe, I think that's pretty plausible. I can see that happening. I can really see companies just trying to sort of turn a blind eye and not look at the geopolitical scale, even if, I think the news would have likely broken in some manner about the Holocaust, and maybe that might have turned public opinion. But that is something that I can realistically see because companies are always, looking for the bottom line, of course. And as well with sort of equating Germans and Nazis and sort of just seeing them as Germans, if that makes any sense. So seeing the Nazi party as being that of ethnic Germans and being able to equate them. Interesting idea. Obviously, a lot of the northeast of the United States is full of Germans. It's a very dominant, what would you say, immigrant group from that region of the United States, and I think I can see that there would sort of be a slow acceptance over time if Germany never goes to war with the United States. However, there would be a lot of pressure from the British royal family, obviously Canada up there in the north, as well as the British Empire for America to do something. So I want to say yes and agree with him, but I just need to think of like how much pressure there would be on the United States government for even them to declare war, right? Not for Hitler to declare war on the United States, but rather the opposite manner, right? And and one thing I'm glad he points out, and it is unfortunately true, is that the sort of policies towards Germans would probably be more friendly than to Japanese, just because of the sort of, can just say it outright, the sort of racism that would come with that, right? With Germans being more, with them being of European descent and less foreign, so to say. So perhaps being more accepted than the Japanese.
As years went on, the Nazis were still German, which was better to the US than the Japanese.
Yep.
But would this mean the American public would accept Nazism? With fascism certainly establishing itself by force in Europe, would it leak into the American political atmosphere as well? In the 1930s, fascism never gained mainstream traction. It was simply anti-American in the political sense. Even groups like the KKK, which preached for white supremacy, still disagree with Adolf Hitler's authoritarianism. The Constitution was still seen as the greatest government document to run the country. In this alternate timeline, the success of Hitler in Europe inspires homegrown groups inside the United States. True political authoritarian fascism never would take off in the US. However, the social views of racial segregation and anti-Semitism could easily be more reinforced and appeal to the American whites. In this alternate timeline, if the United States and Nazi government never went to war, some American whites would attempt to model their country's social policy off of the Germans, at least to an extent. As the civil rights movement gained steam, many whites would look to the Nazis. In this alternate timeline, if Nazism did not crash and the Third Reich remained prominent, it could influence populations far outside its empire. Americans might even view the Nazis as destroyers of communism, as the Soviet Union was incredibly unpopular amongst the population. If Nazi Germany boomed economically, the success drives even more Americans to Nazi beliefs. Civil rights progress is set back
and that's George Wallace. Terrible human being, ran for president in, I believe, 1964, I want to say, on maybe 1968, on a segregationist bill. He infamously said, "Segregation now, segregation forever." Just a piece of work of a human being.
Decades, as Nazism is an influence for Europeans across the globe. While the two countries officially would be cold enemies, the US holds many Nazi sympathizers.
Fascinating.
These sympathizers can vote, creating a potential Nazi base within the US voter population. Politics change in the US revolving around whether to befriend or to hate the Third Reich. Since Hitler's decision not to go to war with the US does not end in a nuclear war, this scenario of Nazi and American fragile peace is the one which we continue with for the rest of the series. In part 4, the United States is left with a choice: to accept the new order which has fallen on Europe, or to continue in a path of defending its interests and allies, even the former British Empire, which now is headed by the royal family across the Canadian border.
Fascinating. Wow, what a great question, and something that I can't just sit here and think what would be the best answer of what would happen, because you're right, the whole social order changes, right? Especially with, America's stain on sort of race relations, right? And how this would probably get worse if seeing that fascism was a so-called successful model in Europe. That's incredibly hard to say as to whether the pressure from the former allies, right? You also need to think about the Free French government here too, which assumably would still be in Africa in some manner, though he hasn't talked about it. And the British government to the north in Canada, and how much influence they would have. But wow, what a fascinating idea. Yeah, something that I really just need to sit and think on for a little bit more. That's not something that I can just instantly give my thoughts on and go, yeah, I would go this way or this way. Cool. So I guess part 4, that'll be our final Thank you all for those who make it this far into the video. About 30% of you only make it this far. So for you who have, thank you very much. I appreciate you. And yeah, I'll see you guys in part 4. Hope you're enjoying it so far. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Would the USA with the German model sort of slip more towards sort of seeing fascism as acceptable, or do you think it would be completely anti-fascist? Who knows? Let me know what you guys think. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.